Willow Creek Estates, a picture-perfect neighborhood nestled just outside Austin, Texas. Quiet streets lined with neat houses, manicured lawns, and towering oak trees that have stood for generations. It's the kind of place where you'd expect peace, harmony, and a sense of community. But beneath the surface, there's a darker story. The Homeowners Association, run by Catherine Walters, holds a tight grip on the neighborhood, enforcing rules with ruthless precision. Fines for the most trivial things, garden gnomes, flags, even the color of your door, are just the beginning. For years, residents have quietly complied, too afraid to challenge the system. But when a $10,000 fine for leaves is slapped on one man's door, something changes. Ethan Miller, a teacher who just moved here, won't stay silent. This isn't just about a fine. It's about standing up to an unjust system that has controlled their lives for far too long. He's not fighting for just himself anymore. He's fighting for the whole community. Ethan Miller had just moved to Willow Creek Estates, a peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. His new home, modest yet charming, was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to build a life. The neighborhood, with its quiet streets and tall oak trees, seemed perfect, especially with the large backyard that reminded him of his childhood. But this dream was shattered one chilly November morning. Ethan walked up to his front door and saw a bright red envelope from the Willow Creek HOA. His stomach sank as he opened it, expecting the usual, harmless notice about yard maintenance or upcoming events. Instead, he found a $10,000 fine for failing to remove fallen leaves from his yard within 24 hours of a recent storm. Leaves confused and angry, Ethan reread the letter. The fine was absurd. The wind had barely stopped blowing, and the leaves were still drifting across his lawn. But the letter was clear. $10,000. No warning, no grace period, just a fine for not clearing leaves quickly enough. It felt like a petty, vindictive move, aimed more at asserting control than maintaining any real community standard. Ethan knew this wasn't just about leaves. It was about Catherine Walters, the HOA president, who had a reputation for using the rules as a weapon to control the neighborhood. Catherine was known for fining residents over minor infractions, holiday lights, garden gnomes, and even mailboxes. She ruled the community with an iron fist, and Ethan had just become her latest target. Frustrated, Ethan decided to talk to his neighbor, Ted Roberts, a retired Army veteran who had lived in Willow Creek Estates for decades. Ted had always been friendly, but Ethan hadn't realized how much he too had been affected by the HOA's oppressive tactics. When Ethan showed Ted the fine, Ted's face hardened. "You too," he muttered, his voice full of bitterness. "Last year they fined me for putting up a flagpole in my yard." A flagpole. This place is becoming a dictatorship. Catherine's got it all under her control. Ethan sat down, his frustration growing. A flagpole. But this $10,000 for leaves, what can I do? How can we stop her? Ted leaned back, taking a long sip of his coffee. "You can't do it alone, son. But you can start talking to your neighbors. They're scared of her, but most of them are suffering in silence. You need to stand up or she'll keep making the rules." Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't just pay the fine. This wasn't right. This wasn't about a few leaves on his lawn. This was about Catherine Walters using the HOA to maintain control and punish anyone who dared challenge her. He stood up, determined. "I'm going to fight this. I don't know how yet, but I will." Ted nodded. "I admire your courage, Ethan. Just don't expect it to be easy. Catherine doesn't like losing control." As Ethan walked back to his house, he realized that the fight wasn't just for $10,000. It was about something much bigger. He wasn't going to let Catherine Walters intimidate him into submission. He would stand up for what was right, not just for himself, but for everyone in Willow Creek Estates who had suffered under her rule. Determined not to let Catherine Walters and the Willow Creek HOA crush his spirit, Ethan Miller began planning his next steps. He knew that $10,000 for fallen leaves wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was part of a larger pattern of abuse. If Catherine could fine him for something so trivial, what other rules was she enforcing with the same level of cruelty? Ethan needed to learn more. He spent days reading through the HOA's bylaws and rules pages and pages of dense legal language that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate. But as he dug deeper, he discovered something unsettling. There were no clear, specific guidelines about leaf removal or any similar fines. It was a loophole. Catherine had been using vague rules to wield her power and impose fines for whatever she saw fit. Realizing he couldn't fight this alone, Ethan reached out to his neighbor, Nina Carson, a single mother who owned a local calf. Nina had lived in Willow Creek Estates for several years and had been fined numerous times for having unsightly flower beds or decorations that didn't meet the HOA's arbitrary standards. Nina had been too afraid to challenge the system before. But now with Ethan standing up, she felt a spark of hope. Ethan visited Nina one afternoon at her calf, which had a cozy, rustic charm. She greeted him with a tired smile as he entered. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" she asked as she wiped her hands on her apron. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then laid out the situation. "I'm fighting this fine for leaves, but it's bigger than that. Catherine's been using her power to impose ridiculous fines, and I'm not the only one suffering. I need your help. We need to fight back." "Bo?" Nina looked around the calf, her eyes narrowing with thought. "I've had enough," she said quietly. "They fined me $1,500 because the flowers I planted weren't the right color. They said my garden didn't match the community's approved aesthetic. I had to rip everything out." Ethan's blood boiled. He couldn't believe it. A garden, fined for a garden. "That's insane, Nina," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "We have to stop this. It's not just about a fine. It's about Catherine abusing her power and controlling everyone." She nodded, her eyes burning with frustration. "I've been too scared to do anything about it, but I can't stand by anymore." Determined to gain momentum, Ethan realized they needed more support from the community. The next evening, he knocked on the door of Ted Roberts, his older, retired military neighbor. Ted had lived in Willow Creek for nearly 40 years, but had become increasingly bitter about the HOA's control over his property. When Ted opened the door, Ethan didn't waste any time. "Ted, we need your help. I'm fighting the HOA over this fine for leaves, and I think Catherine's been abusing her power for years. She's been fining people over the smallest things. We need to take action together." Ted's weathered face softened, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. He had been fighting his own battles with Catherine for years, but had never truly thought to rally the neighbors. "I'll stand with you," Ted said, his voice resolute. "They fined me $2,000 for having a flagpole in my yard. A flagpole, Ethan. They told me it didn't match the community style." Ethan's mind raced as he began to realize just how deep this issue went. It wasn't just him. Everyone had been affected by Catherine's iron grip on the neighborhood. He asked Ted, "Do you know anyone else who's been fined?" Ted thought for a moment and then nodded. "Talk to George and Sarah. They've had their own run-ins with Catherine's rules. Sarah was fined for having a few too many lawn ornaments. And George had a small garden statue that she deemed unsightly." Ethan felt a growing sense of solidarity. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was the neighborhood's fight. With Ted's encouragement, Ethan went door to door over the next few days, speaking with other residents. He spoke to George, a retired police officer who had been fined for an unsightly lawn ornament that paid tribute to his late wife. He spoke to Sarah, a single mother who had been fined for too much noise during her child's birthday party. Each resident had a story, each one more ridiculous than the last. But together, they formed a powerful case against the HOA's unfair practices. With the support of Nina, Ted, and the others, Ethan knew they needed to take their fight public. He called a meeting at his home to gather everyone. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. He stood in front of them, holding a stack of petition signatures and documents from the residents who had been targeted. "We can't let this continue. We've been bullied long enough," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "It's time to fight back." We need to demand a formal review of the HOA's practices. We need to show Catherine that we're not afraid anymore. We'll take this to the next HOA meeting." Lily Chen, the lawyer who had agreed to help Ethan, joined the group and began preparing their case. Together, they drafted a petition and compiled all the evidence they had gathered. It was time for Catherine Walters to face the consequences of her abuse of power. The residents of Willow Creek Estates were united, and they were ready for the battle ahead. The night of the HOA meeting had arrived, and Willow Creek Estates was buzzing with energy. Ethan Miller stood at the back of the crowded room, his heart pounding in his chest. Around him were his neighbors, Ted, Nina, George, Sarah, and others who had come together for the first time to confront the tyranny of Catherine Walters, the HOA president, who had controlled their lives for far too long. The meeting room was packed, the air thick with frustration and anticipation. They weren't just there to discuss fines anymore. They were there to reclaim their neighborhood. As the meeting began, Catherine Walters entered the room with her usual sense of authority, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. She wore a tailored suit, and her demeanor was as cold and calculating as ever. She took her place at the front of the room, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, clearly irritated by the number of people who had shown up. Her control over the neighborhood had always been unchallenged, but tonight was different. Ethan exchanged a glance with Nina, who was sitting beside him, and they both nodded in silent agreement. This was it. They had spent weeks gathering signatures, collecting stories from their neighbors, and preparing their case. They had legal support, a petition, and irrefutable evidence of the HOA's wrongful actions. Catherine couldn't ignore them this time. The meeting proceeded as usual, with Catherine running the show. She moved through the agenda with practiced ease, her voice ringing out as she read off the minutes and updates. Ethan sat in the back, his eyes fixed on her, the weight of what he was about to do hanging in the air. Finally, the open forum began. Catherine looked around and her gaze landed on Ethan. "Mr. Miller, the floor is yours," she said, her tone polite but laced with a condescending edge. Ethan stood, the rustle of papers in his hand, the only sound in the room. As he made his way to the front, he felt the eyes of everyone on him. His nerves were on edge, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every neighbor who had been crushed under Catherine's rule. With the petition and the fine for leaves in his hand, Ethan spoke, his voice steady and clear. "Catherine Walters, you've ruled this neighborhood with fear for far too long. But tonight, the people of Willow Creek Estates are standing up. We're no longer willing to let you make decisions for us based on vague rules and unfair fines. $10,000 for leaves. It's not just about the fine. It's about how you've used your position to manipulate and punish anyone who dares to challenge your authority." Catherine's face hardened, and her lips curled into a small, dismissive smile. She was used to being in control. "The rules are clear. Mr. Miller, Section 5B of the Community Standards, states that all fallen leaves must be removed within 24 hours. You failed to comply, and the fine reflects the seriousness of the infraction." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling his anger rise, but he kept his voice calm. "It's not about leaves, Catherine. You've used rules like this to target residents for anything you can. You've fined Ted for a flagpole, Sarah for noise at her child's birthday party, and George for a simple lawn ornament. You've wielded your power like a weapon, and it's time for it to stop." The room fell silent. Ted stood up slowly, his voice gruff but unwavering. "She's right. We've all been targeted for things that shouldn't matter. We've been living in fear of arbitrary fines, forced to comply with rules that have no meaning. It's not about maintaining a community. It's about control." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Nina joined in, her voice strong. "We're tired of living like this. You can't keep punishing people for things that don't matter. We're demanding a change, Catherine. We won't be silenced anymore." Catherine's smile faded. The room was shifting, the power dynamics changing before her eyes. She was no longer the one in control. She looked around, her expression flickering with uncertainty. For the first time in years, Ethan stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. "We've reviewed the HOA bylaws. You've broken your own rules. According to Section 34, no fine can be issued without a written warning. Not a single resident has been given proper notice before being fined. Including myself, your actions are not just unethical, they are illegal. At that moment, Lily Chen, the attorney who had been helping Ethan, stood up beside him. We've also discovered that the HOA has made changes to its bylaws without a majority vote, which is a violation of the HOA's charter. These unilateral changes have allowed Catherine to consolidate power and abuse her position for personal gain. The crowd gasped. Catherine Walters looked like she had been struck. For a brief moment, she faltered, her grip on the gavel tightening. "This is a disruption of our community," she said, trying to regain control, but the words lacked the usual confidence. "We cannot allow this to continue." But it was too late. The community was no longer afraid. Ted, Nina, Sarah, and others stood up, their voices growing louder. "We demand accountability. Catherine, you've overstepped. It's time for you to step down." For the first time, Catherine Walters was cornered, her facade of power crumbling. As the meeting descended into chaos, Ethan knew they had won. The fight was far from over, but the first major battle had been won. The community was united, and Catherine's reign was finally beginning to unravel.